I'm Evelyn Hartley, a former military strategist, erased by my own family. They laughed behind full wine glasses, called me a failure. Right before a Pentagon officer walked into that room, ignored my sister completely and saluted me as general. If you've ever been erased by the people who were supposed to stand by you, stay with me. This story isn't just mine. It's for anyone who's ever had to prove their worth in silence. 5 years. That's how long I'd been gone. Long enough for them to forget the shape of my seat at the table, but not long enough to remove me from the mailing list. The invitation arrived in a plain envelope. No return address, no handwriting, just a pre-printed card that read, "You are cordially invited to celebrate Marina Hartley's promotion to First Lieutenant. No, we'd love to see you. No, hope you've been well. Just logistics. I said I'd go. Not out of excitement, but because indifference can sometimes look like strength. I drove alone. The GPS still knew the roads better than I did. The restaurant sat nestled between a private marina and a boutique hotel, upscale but not loud about it. I knew the type. White napkins, men in blazers, women in neutral lipsticks, tables set just far enough apart for quiet judgment to breathe. I was 5 minutes early. I'm always early. In the army, punctuality is respect. In my family, it was just another way I came across as too rigid. Through the tall windows, I could see them already seated. My parents' perfectly polished drinks in hand, my uncles and aunts laughing a little too loudly, and there she was, Marina, centered under a pendant light glowing like a magazine cover in navy dress blues. Even the medals looked like they were told to behave. I took a breath and opened the door. The hostess looked up. "Reservation name Hartley," I said. She checked, smiled with the efficiency of someone used to handling big family dinners, and motioned me to the back room. As I stepped in, conversation faltered, just for a second, long enough for Marina's smile to freeze, for my mother's fingers to twitch on the edge of her wine glass. Then it picked up again, seamless, as if I'd never walked away in the first place. "Evelyn," Marina said, rising partially from her seat. "You made it." Her tone was smooth, but the surprise was real. I imagined she'd bet I wouldn't come. I nodded. "Congratulations." She gestured toward an empty chair. It was at the end of the table, slightly tucked in with no name card. "We weren't sure you'd be joining us," one of my cousins said from across the table. She offered a polite smile, the kind that lands somewhere between awkward and condescending. "You can take that seat." The words sat heavily on my chest. Take that seat. Not your seat. Just one someone had left unclaimed. I slid in without a word. The server came by to pour champagne into crystal flutes etched with family names. He skipped over me entirely. I requested water. He didn't ask if I wanted anything else. The appetizers arrived. No one asked how I'd been. Not a single person inquired about where I lived now, what I did, or why I hadn't been around. It was as if I'd always been an occasional guest, one of those distant relatives people invite to be polite but secretly hope doesn't show. But I was there, wearing a black blazer that didn't quite zip all the way up anymore. Neat, clean, nothing loud. I had debated whether to wear my old dress uniform just to remind them. But then I realized, if they needed reminding, they never really saw me to begin with. Dinner flowed like a staged performance. Marina's boss gave a short speech about her leadership potential. My uncle recounted how she used to organize her toys by rank. My mother dabbed her eyes when Marina mentioned Grandpa's service in Korea as her inspiration. They spoke in circles of shared pride. I sat at the edge of it all, chewing each bite slowly, methodically, as if silence were a tactic. Then came the toast. My father stood, glass raised just a little higher than necessary. "To those who serve with honor," he said, his voice ringing with practiced clarity, "and those who merely serve themselves." A beat, then laughter. Hesitant at first, then flowing freely. Marina smirked into her glass. One of my aunts let out a chuckle that sounded rehearsed. I kept my eyes on my plate. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I simply reached for my water and took a measured sip. That toast. It wasn't spontaneous. It was crafted. My father had waited for the perfect moment between creme brulee and champagne to deliver a message that would echo without being shouted. And the message was clear. You are not one of us. Not anymore. Maybe never were. I clenched my fork under the table, feeling the dull edge of steel press into my palm. I could have responded. I could have told them where I'd been, what I'd seen, what I'd endured. But what would have been the point? They weren't interested in stories. They had already written the ending. Instead, I sat back, let their laughter pass over me like wind, and stared at the reflections in the wine glasses. I thought about the invoice I had paid for the reservation, quietly through the restaurant's corporate office so it would appear prepaid as a gift from the base. They didn't know. They wouldn't care. They never asked. Because acknowledgement in this family came with conditions. And I'd stopped meeting them the day I chose a different war to fight. So I stayed silent. Because sometimes silence is heavier than any words. And sometimes it's all you have left that still feels like yours. The morning after the promotion dinner, I woke before the house stirred. The walls were still and too familiar. The kind of quiet that belonged to early childhood, when you'd sneak down the stairs hoping not to wake anyone, not because you feared them, but because you weren't sure they'd welcome you if they noticed. The house hadn't changed much. Same rug with the frayed edge near the hall closet. Same cabinet with the crooked hinge in the kitchen. But it didn't feel like home. Not anymore. It felt like walking through a memory someone else had edited. I wandered into the living room, drawn toward the old photo display that took up half the wall. It was my mother's version of a family tree, only instead of names and branches, it was medals and smiles behind glass. There was Grandpa in black and white, standing tall in his World War II fatigues. My father in Vietnam, bronze medal shining like a badge of legacy. And then Marina, centered perfectly framed in polished walnut, her graduation photo from the Officer Training Academy. Her expression, confident lips, just slightly parted like she was about to speak a promise she intended to keep. I stood there for a long time. Something was missing. Or maybe not missing. Just replaced. My photo. Once in the center, taken the day I graduated from Westview Academy in full dress blues, was gone. In its place was a cheerful Christmas portrait. No uniform, no indication of what I'd done or who I'd once been. Just the family posed in coordinated red sweaters the year I hadn't come home. I said it softly, like I wasn't even sure I was asking, "Where's the old photo of me in uniform?" My mother didn't look up from the tray of deviled eggs she was preparing on the counter. She stirred too slowly, like she was buying time. "Oh, that one. It was getting a bit old. I figured we'd use something more recent." She still didn't meet my eyes. Her gaze drifted past me out the kitchen window, like I wasn't standing in front of her, but somewhere farther, like a shadow stretched across the tile floor. I didn't push. There was nothing to argue. The photo was hers to display or hide. But something in me cracked anyway. Not a break exactly. More like a quiet shift, the way a wall begins to lean before it ever falls. Later that afternoon, I walked past the hallway cabinet where my father kept miscellaneous things. Old chargers, dusty batteries, keys with no locks. I pulled open the bottom drawer and saw it, the frame, still intact but emptied. The glass clean, the photo removed. In its place was the stock cardboard insert that came with it. A family smiling vaguely, no names, no context. It looked so natural you might think it had always been that way. They hadn't thrown it out. That would have been too blunt. They'd shelved it, like they shelved me. Not erased, just omitted. A few hours later, we gathered for a backyard potluck. Veterans Day was a good excuse to parade pride, and my father never missed a chance to honor uniforms, so long as they belonged to someone who still fit his version of service. Neighbors from his unit came. Aunts, uncles, old family friends. Marina circulated gracefully like a hostess who knew exactly which spotlight to stand in. I sat near the water cooler, a folding chair pulled from the garage. Not uncomfortable, just symbolic. No one said it out loud, but I could feel it. I was here because I was family. Technically. At one point, a cousin I barely remembered sat down beside me with a paper plate full of coleslaw and ribs. He smiled. "So what are you up to these days?" Before I could answer, Marina's voice rang out across the table. "Oh, Evelyn used to do some kind of consulting, right?" she said, not looking at me. "I think now she's mostly home, sort of in early retirement." Someone chuckled from the far end. "Office jobs are safer anyway. Less mess." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It wasn't sharp. That made it worse. It was casual. Dismissive in a way only family can be when they've already written you out of the story and no longer think they need to check if you're still reading along. I stood up and walked toward the drinks table, pouring myself a cup of lukewarm lemonade from a plastic pitcher. My hand trembled just slightly, not from anger, just from weight, not physical, emotional. The kind that accumulates in layers you pretend not to notice. That's when I heard it. Strickland. Evelyn Strickland. The voice was low, roughened by age and cigarettes and memory. I turned. A man stood behind me. Gray hair, cropped short sleeves, rolled posture, still military sharp. I didn't recognize him, but he looked at me like he already knew everything. "I think I read your name on the Crescent Directive," he said. "Hell of a plan." I raised an eyebrow, unsure how to respond. "I heard that plan had too many pages." He smiled just slightly. "Maybe. But it saved lives." He gave me a nod. Firm, respectful. The kind you can't fake. Not a lot of credit passed around for that. "Was there?" he said. "No," I replied. But that was never the point. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. That one nod meant more than the 20 years of polite dismissal I'd endured at home. And in that moment, it reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. Even when people try to erase you, the truth has a way of finding its voice again. Sometimes in a headline, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes in a nod at a lemonade table on a day no one expected you to still stand tall. By late afternoon, the yard was full. Folding chairs lined the patio like troops in loose formation. Plastic tablecloths flapped in the breeze, printed with faded American flags and scattered stains from spilled potato salad. Someone had fired up the old speaker by the porch, and "America the Beautiful" played on loop, slightly warped from sun damage and dust. I stood at the back gate for a while before stepping in. No one noticed. It's strange the way you can exist in full view of people who once raised you and still feel like a ghost walking through their shadows. I wasn't uninvited. I'd just been unremembered. There's a difference. "Evelyn." "There you are," a woman called. My father's cousin, maybe? I hadn't seen her in years, but she smiled as though nothing had passed between us but time. "We weren't sure you'd made it. Come on in." Her tone was chipper, empty, like a retail clerk welcoming you into a store you didn't ask to be in. She led me past the main cluster of guests, where Marina stood in full uniform chatting with neighbors. Her hair was pulled into a neat bun, her boots polished to a mirror shine. She looked radiant. Undeniably so. Her medals caught the light like spotlights designed just for her. "Let's find you a seat," the cousin said, scanning the patio. "Oh, this one's saved for Lieutenant Hartley." She pointed, hand landing on a chair with a printed name tag and a small embroidered cushion. "Would you mind sliding over there?" She gestured vaguely to the far corner near the water dispenser. I nodded. I was used to being redirected. The chair she offered wasn't uncomfortable, just symbolic. It had no cushion, no name tag, no shade. No one sat beside it. It was positioned close enough to hear the laughter, but too far to be part of it. When I sat down, I noticed something on the table. 4 glass tumblers each with names etched into their sides in perfect serif font: Mike, Helen, Marina, Dad. My own spot had only a disposable plastic cup. Blank, light, stackable. I turned it slowly in my hand. It struck me how easily something without weight could make you feel heavy. From my seat, I could see the photo display Mom had carefully assembled against the garage wall, a shrine of legacy. It had grown since I'd last looked at it. Now it included framed articles, graduation plaques, even a laminated certificate from Marina's National Guard Leadership Seminar. Grandpa in black and white, Dad in olive green, Marina in full dress blues. And me, I wasn't there. I'd once sent them a framed photo from the day I took my oath. I remembered the way I stood in that photo, back straight, jaw, firm, hands clenched not from nerves, but from purpose. The glass had caught a glint of sunlight on my collar pin. Now that image had been replaced by a cheerful Christmas photo. No uniform, no trace of service. Just my parents, Marina, and a dog that had died 2 years ago. I stepped closer to the display and stood still. People bustled past me with paper plates, but none paused to ask what I was looking at. It was as if I wasn't looking at anything at all. I stared until my eyes blurred. And when they cleared again, the memory came rushing back, not from nostalgia, but from muscle memory. That night in the Crescent War Room, 12 Allied units waiting on my call. The satellite readouts had shown an open corridor. The protocol said advance. But something in my gut said no. I'd studied too many maps, seen too many ambushes dressed up as opportunities. The terrain looked too clean, the timing too perfect. I held the line. 12 minutes later, the corridor erupted in fire. Mortar shells cratered the path we would have walked. Had I followed orders, we'd have lost over 300 soldiers. Instead, I became the problem. The hesitation. The miscommunication. Command didn't like ghosts with instincts. They liked reports with clean endings. So I took the fall. They redacted the report, removed my name, my contribution, my command. But the soldiers lived, and that had been enough. At least it had been then. I returned to my chair by the drink station and stared down at my blank cup. All the other tumblers had names engraved in glass. My name had been engraved in memory, then wiped clean. And still I remembered. Sometimes honor doesn't need a nameplate, but if someone dares to speak it aloud, don't stop them. "Excuse me, ma'am." I turned. A boy stood in front of me, 16 or 17, barely past the height of the folding table. He wore a too big cap and clutched a soda like it might spill from nerves. "Are you really a general?" His voice cracked on the last word, not with sarcasm, but with awe. I blinked, surprised. No one here had acknowledged my title in years. I hadn't heard it spoken aloud since the tribunal. I didn't smile. I just nodded once. I said, "Once." He looked like he didn't know what to say next, so I filled the silence. One time I gave the order not to fire, I said, voice calm, even when the protocol said I could. There were children in the target zone. His eyebrows lifted. He stopped fidgeting. "I chose consequences over casualties," I said. Then I looked him straight in the eye and asked, "What title do you think that earns?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His expression changed, not dramatically, not with wide eyes or gasps, but in that subtle, serious way kids carry when something real finally touches them. He nodded, turned, and walked away. And just like that, for the first time that day, I didn't feel erased. The restaurant was more fortress than fine dining, its walls adorned with military emblems, oil portraits of stern-faced generals, and plaques mounted with decades of medals and names that weighed heavy in rooms like this. A glass case near the front displayed a folded flag beneath a brass plate that simply read, "Honor." Above all, I arrived early, of course. It's what people like me do. We show up before anyone can accuse us of not belonging. The woman at the check-in table was young, probably new, her eyes scanning her list with the kind of brisk efficiency only the underprepared have. When she looked up at me, her smile was polite, but blank. "And you're a guest of—" I opened my mouth to answer. Probably would have said Marina's name, though, I'm not sure why. When a voice slipped in from behind me like a shadow. "She's just family," Marina said, breezing past my shoulder, with a smile so smooth it could have been laminated. "Used to be admin support or something. She's here for me." My mouth closed. She said it like it was a favor, like she'd just rescued me from the awkwardness of having to introduce myself. The officer blinked, nodded, and handed me a plain cardstock seating slip. No table number, no title, no color, just my name hastily scribbled in ballpoint ink. The room was already filling. Families of other officers gathered in clusters, their voices echoing softly against the polished wooden floor. Everyone wore their best dress uniforms, evening wear shoes that had never touched gravel. Red, white, blue bunting curved along the ceiling like ceremonial streamers. A screen above the stage cycled through images of Marina in training, Marina receiving commendations, Marina shaking hands with someone whose name everyone was meant to recognize. I was escorted to a table near the far wall, tucked just beside a catering tray and a speaker stand. My place setting consisted of a folded napkin, a side plate, and a glass of water that looked like it had already been sipped. No name tag, no gesture that I was meant to be seen, much less acknowledged. I sat down anyway. This wasn't my stage. It hadn't been for years. Dinner was served in courses I barely tasted. Around me, silverware clinked, laughter rang politely, and toasts rose like signals of a world I'd once been part of, now past. Then Marina approached the podium. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice had always carried. Years of debate clubs, officer evaluations, and family dinners, where being the loudest meant you got to finish your story. She stood straight, shoulders pulled back in her decorated dress, blue's eyes bright beneath lashes curled with deliberation. I want to share a quick story. She began. When I was a kid, my sister once said to me, "You go ahead and try. I don't think I can keep up with you." And that stuck with me. That was the moment I promised myself I'd never quit, no matter how hard it got. A few soft laughs murmured through the room. People turned toward me curious. Some smiled. The kind of expression you give someone who used to be something, before they became a supporting character in someone else's spotlight. I didn't react. I held my fork. I kept my gaze fixed on the tablecloth and counted the red stripes in the pattern like I was tracing a map back to somewhere I'd already learned not to go. She made me her anecdote, her backstory, her stepping stone, and I let her. Because there's something worse than being left out of the story, being rewritten into the background. As the applause swelled and the next round of drinks circulated, I began to retreat into my thoughts. That familiar defense, pulling inward, hiding in plain sight. If anyone asked, I was just proud, just quiet, just family. Then the doors opened. It wasn't loud. No music. No announcement. Just a quiet shift in the atmosphere. A man stepped through wearing dress blues so crisp they looked sculpted. Silver insignia gleamed on his chest. His gait was measured, precise. You could feel the years of command in the way he walked, like every step had purpose. Colonel Hayes. I knew him instantly. Not just from the war room, but from the silence that followed it. A man who didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. Marina noticed him first. She straightened and started moving toward him. Smile locked into place. "Colonel Hayes, sir. I didn't know you." But he didn't stop for her. Didn't even slow down. His eyes scanned the room, locked onto me, and held. He crossed the floor in a straight line, stopped at my table, and stood at full attention. Then he saluted. "General Hartley," he said, his voice calm but clear enough to slice through the hum of the entire dining hall. "Ma'am, it's been far too long." Silence. Real silence. Not the polite kind, not the expectant kind. The stunned, heavy silence of people realizing they've been clapping for the wrong person. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. "Sir," I said, nodding once. "Good to see you again." Someone near the front dropped their fork. From the rear of the room, a whispered voice floated. "Wait." She's a General. Colonel Hayes turned to the table of junior officers seated behind him. He didn't raise his voice, but no one missed a word. "This woman coordinated the withdrawal routes during Operation Crescent," he said, gesturing toward me. "Half of NATO owes her their necks." Literally. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not applause, not awe. Recalibration. People looked at me differently now, like they were trying to remember what they'd once been told, and realizing how much of it had been missing. I didn't smile. I didn't shift in my seat. I didn't correct anyone. Because sometimes truth doesn't need defending. It just needs space to breathe. And finally, after all those years of silence, someone had cleared the air. The house was dark, quiet in that eerie way familiar spaces become when you no longer feel like you belong in them. I sat in the guest room folding laundry that wasn't mine. Old towels with frayed edges. A sweatshirt that might have been Dad's or Marina's or mine from years ago. I couldn't tell anymore. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like waiting, like a breath held too long. Then my phone buzzed. No name, no caller ID. Just a number I didn't recognize and a single message that chilled me faster than any winter wind. "They're digging into Crescent. Journalists have old files. Your name's in them. Be careful." That was all it said. No punctuation, no sender. But it was enough. Crescent. The name hit me like a punch in the sternum. I hadn't heard it in years, hadn't let myself think it out loud. Crescent was the operation that ended my career, that saw my name quietly erased from the record, so someone higher up could keep their reputation intact. The message didn't say what files, but if they had my name, then the silence I'd upheld for so long was cracking. I moved fast. Reflex, really. I pulled out my laptop and forwarded the tip to the only person I trusted with something this dangerous. Sarah Whittam, a former analyst who once specialized in secure intelligence routing. We had worked together on a few operations. She had a gift for finding ghosts in the machine. Subject line Crescent. Urgent. Attached a request for trace metadata search device origin logs, anything that could tell me where the leak had come from. Then I waited. 3 hours passed. Just after midnight, my phone rang. Sarah's name glowed on the screen. Her voice was tight, controlled. Evelyn, the access point came from a National Guard device. Registered out of your state. I already knew where this was going. Whose, I asked anyway. A beat. Then it was issued to your sister. 2 years ago. Silence. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't believe it, but because part of me already had. Sarah waited, then said softly, "What do you want me to do?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Nothing yet. I'll handle it." The next morning, I drove to Marina's base. No calls. No warning. I walked through the gates like I still wore the rank to justify it. In some ways, I did. She was in the break room sipping from a branded mug, scrolling her phone like it didn't matter. I dropped a printed trace file on the table. She looked up, then down. Her eyes scanned the header, the metadata, the access log. She didn't deny it. Her jaw tightened. "I sent it," she said finally. Her voice clipped. "Last year. I was tired of people whispering about you, about how perfect you were. Even when you weren't here, I was still in your shadow." I stood there silent. Not because I was shocked, but because I wasn't. "You think I don't know what it feels like to be erased?" I asked quietly. "The difference is, I never tried to erase you." She looked away. "Shame has a shape, and I saw it in her posture." "I was wrong," she whispered. "I know that now, but people still see you. You shine even when you're not trying to. I just wanted for once to be seen first." We sat in that truth together. Two sisters both haunted, one by being forgotten, the other by her choice to forget someone else. Eventually I stood. "I didn't come here to reclaim my honor," I said. "I came to keep the truth from being rewritten." Marina said nothing. Her hands were still shaking. Later that day I received a formal summons. The guard had initiated an internal inquiry. Marina was facing potential suspension, possibly dishonorable discharge. They had traced the leak back to her device. I knew what I had to do. At the review board hearing, I wore my old service coat. No medals. Just the fabric, plain and honest. The panel sat behind a long oak table, back straight, eyes hard. "What do you know about the breach of protocol involving Captain Hartley's access to Operation Crescent files?" one asked. I answered without flinching. "I gave the order," I said. She reaccessed the files under my directive. I was investigating a record anomaly. "Any breach in security protocol is mine alone." A pause. The panel looked at each other. "You're not in active service," another said slowly. "Are you suggesting you acted beyond your current clearance?" "Yes," I said, "and I accept full responsibility." It was a lie. But it wasn't betrayal. It was a shield. Because the truth was that Marina had been trying to erase me, but I refused to become her reason for being erased in return. We left the hearing together. She didn't say thank you. I didn't need her to. Some things are heavier than gratitude. Some debts live in silence. That night, I returned to my temporary office at the academy. Something felt off. The door hadn't been locked, but it had been tampered with. Inside, everything looked in place, except the USB drive containing Crescent's key audio file was missing. In its place, someone had left a single note. "You think you're the only one who remembers how war works?" At the bottom, a red ink stamp, an eagle clutching arrows, the emblem of an off-book DoD unit disbanded after Crescent. No name. No explanation. Just a warning. And a promise the war I thought I had left behind wasn't over. It had just changed uniforms. It started with silence. Not the comforting kind. Not even the weighty pause of a room holding its breath. This silence was laced with dread. The kind that arrives when something should have happened but didn't. Sarah Whittam was gone. No texts, no calls, no response to the secure line. I'd pinged her 4 times in 24 hours, each one more urgent than the last. She never missed check-ins. She was cautious to a fault, the kind of person who layered her life with digital decoys and fake apartment leases. If she vanished, it wasn't by choice. Then a message came through, encrypted. The address was scrambled, but the phrasing, the tone, it was her. I'm alive. They're holding me at the old comms post south of Fort Hamilton. I have the data. Strix Runner is the key. No sign-off. Just that. The comms post had been shut down 5 years earlier, allegedly for budget reasons. But Sarah had a memory like a steel trap. If she said that's where she was, that's where I'd find her. I didn't hesitate, but I didn't go in alone. Colonel Hayes responded to my ping within minutes. Tell me where, he said. I did. He was already moving before I finished the sentence. Then there was Marina. She found me in the Academy's server room, reviewing backup routing paths. Her hair was pulled into a bun that didn't quite hide the tension in her jaw. I want in, she said. I looked up. This isn't about redemption. It's not, she replied. But it's about integrity. And I don't want to sit this one out. Let me be the inside. I studied her face, clear-eyed. No pretense. Not the girl who leaked my name. Not the soldier who borrowed my shadow. I'll wear the badge right this time, she added. I gave a single nod. We built the plan together. Sarah had uploaded the incriminating audio, Vaughn's voice captured during a secure briefing, into a concealed drive labeled Strix Runner. If we could trigger the recording from the AV uplink inside the Arlington Summit, it would go live to every delegate, every military liaison, every officer on site. But we had one shot. Too early, and it would be dismissed as fake. Too late, and Vaughn would bury it in PR spin. Marina's assignment: get inside the summit. She would wear plain fatigue's approach as someone seeking reinstatement, carry the drive under a clipped ID badge. My role: operate the feed van parked 3 blocks from the perimeter. From there, I'd initiate the stream through an old signal box embedded in the north wall. Untouched infrastructure from the summit's early construction days. Redundant. Forgotten. Perfect. We launched the operation at 1600 hours. Marina entered through the south gate. She carried herself like someone between ranks. Tentative, eager, overlooked. She was waved through without question. Inside, the summit buzzed with diplomatic theater. Vaughn stood mid-circle with generals from 6 countries. His suit pressed his smile surgically precise. He spotted her. Captain Hartley, he said, into the space, not even turning. You always had a knack for surviving storms you shouldn't have weathered. Then he looked her in the eye. You know why people like your sister are dangerous. Because they believe justice is more important than logistics. Outside in the van, my fingers hovered over the trigger. I hit broadcast. The speakers inside the summit came alive. Civilian risk noted. Acceptable. Vaughn's voice. Cold. Calculated. Recorded during the Crescent Directive. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, the room froze. Then, static. The audio cut. Someone had found the uplink. I bolted from the van, cables in hand, rerouting the backup feed through an alternate relay point tucked beneath a storm drain. And that's when I heard it. A single shot. I turned. Ethan. He was slumped beside the relay box, one hand pressed to his shoulder. Blood soaked through his uniform sleeve. His face was pale but resolute. I saw them coming, he whispered. Don't let them win with silence. I tightened the strap around his arm and eased him back against the wall. I've got you, I said. He nodded once, then closed his eyes. I ran. Back to the van. Reinitiated the feed. The system flickered, resisted. Then caught. I leaned into the microphone, not as a general, not even as Evelyn Hartley, just as a witness. My name is Evelyn Hartley, I said. I was told I was nobody. But I carry a truth that power tried to erase. When institutions falsify records, soldiers die. When commanders value optics over ethics, families mourn quietly. This recording is real. The risk was civilian lives. The order was given. And the silence ends now. Vaughn's voice echoed again through the summit. Execute Strike Protocol 5A. Civilian risk noted. Acceptable. No more static. No more deniability. Inside the summit hall, every head turned. No one smiled. Security didn't storm us. There were no arrests on the spot. But the room shifted. Legacy cracked. Outside, Marina helped me stabilize the van's uplink while paramedics lifted Ethan into an ambulance. His eyes fluttered open briefly. "You didn't let them bury it," he said. "No," I whispered. "And I won't." That night, my name wasn't trending. There were no headlines yet. But something had broken open. And this time, I wasn't the one being erased. The room was silent, sterile, and far too cold for a place without air conditioning. There were no windows, no digital clocks, just 4 gray walls, a table too clean to feel lived in, and fluorescent lights that hummed like old lies struggling to stay relevant. Marina and I were escorted inside by 2 officers in navy suits, silent, stone-faced, anonymous. They didn't offer us seats. They didn't offer us anything. We weren't being accused. But we weren't exactly invited either. It felt like our identities had been placed into administrative purgatory, waiting to be sorted, buried, or forgotten. We stood there for what felt like an hour, long enough for Marina to start rubbing her thumb over the edge of her ID badge like a nervous tell, long enough for me to memorize the pattern in the wood grain of the table, long enough to wonder whether this was still about security, or if we were simply being reminded who owned the silence. Then the door opened. Vaughn entered with the kind of calm that always struck me as rehearsed. His uniform was flawless. The rows of ribbons on his chest looked more like decoration than merit. His posture was straight, but his fingers fidgeted, just barely, against the side seam of his trousers. He gave no greeting. He walked to the opposite end of the table, placed his hands flat on its surface, and stared directly at me. "You made a lot of noise," he said. I didn't answer. "Unnecessary noise," he clarified. "Messy, but not irreversible." He took a seat, finally adjusting his collar like a man settling into control. "I'm here," he continued, "to offer you peace. A dignified retirement. Full restoration of your rank, Evelyn. Reinstatement if you want it. Clean records. Quiet exits." He shifted his gaze toward Marina. "And your sister walks away without inquiry." His voice softened like he was doing us a favor. In return, he added, "You let the story fade. Let the public forget. Let history reset itself to something more palatable." Marina stiffened. I stepped forward slowly. "You mean silence?" Vaughn gave the faintest smile. "I mean resolution. You walk away with your dignity." "You don't give people dignity," I said quietly. "They carry it. Or they don't." His smile disappeared. "You think this is a win?" he asked, voice tightening. "You made a stir. A few files. One voice recording. The press will bury it in a news cycle or two. And when they do so, will everyone else." He leaned back, folding his arms. "You could have walked away a hero," he said. "Instead, you're making yourself a liability." I met his eyes. "I didn't fight for a headline," I said. "I fought because there were people who died while you orchestrated a cover-up. I fought because silence isn't peace. It's complicity." "And what about her?" he asked, nodding at Marina. "Do you think they'll let her stay? You might walk away with your moral compass, but she'll be discharged by the end of the week." I looked at Marina. Her chin was lifted. She didn't flinch. And that was when the second door opened, not the one Vaughn had used. From the hallway behind us, 3 people entered, stepping quietly but with purpose. Colonel Hayes, Ethan, arms still in a sling but eyes sharp, and behind them Sarah. She looked thinner than before, paler, but upright, breathing, alive. The 3 of them approached without words. Vaughn turned toward them with the kind of sharpness that only comes from fear, disguised as indignation. Sarah walked to the table and placed a hard drive in the center, gently, as if it were something sacred or explosive, or both. "This is everything," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. Vaughn's eyes flicked to the drive. "What is this?" he demanded. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have to. The files spoke for themselves. Wire transfers from the African Relief Fund rerouted to shell accounts. fabricated strike orders signed off through back channels. An untouched backup of the Crescent Audio Directive, his voice authorizing the targeting of civilian zones. "This is fabricated," Vaughn snapped. "This is circumstantial." He reached for the drive, but someone moved faster. Marina. She stepped between him and the table, her body an unwavering wall. "I was afraid of you once," she said. Vaughn froze. Her voice didn't tremble. "I thought obedience meant honor. I thought loyalty was silence. But I've learned better." She held his gaze. "I took an oath of honor, not blind loyalty. And if they discharge me for that, so be it." Vaughn's hand dropped. He looked around the room as if realizing, too late, that he was no longer the axis of control. Colonel Hayes stepped forward. "General Marcus Vaughn," he said, voice formal, firm. "Under Article 14.3 of the Wartime Ethics and Intelligence Oversight Act, you are hereby detained pending full investigation." Two security officers entered behind him. They didn't shout. They didn't rush. They simply moved forward. Vaughn said nothing. As they placed his hands behind his back, the medals on his uniform jingled softly, like coins in a forgotten purse. He was led out of the room without ceremony. The door shut behind him with a dull thud that sounded suspiciously like a gavel. When the silence returned, it no longer felt oppressive. It felt clean. Ethan took a step toward us. His voice was soft. "We can't erase what happened," he said, "but we can make sure no one gets to erase who stood up." Sarah nodded once. Marina blinked back, something in her eyes. And I let myself breathe. Really breathe. For the first time in years, I wasn't being asked to prove my worth. I had already done it. And now the world had finally seen it. The ICU waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and the vending machine in the corner blinked exact change only in quiet defiance. I stood by the glass watching Ethan's chest rise and fall under a tangle of plastic and wires. His arm was bandaged, the sling gone. A monitor beeped at regular intervals, slow and steady, like the rhythm of someone too young to have bled for someone else's truth. A nurse came by, her voice low. "He's stable. A few inches to the right, and it would have been a different conversation." I nodded, but I didn't take my eyes off him. "He's not trained for this," she added. "No," I said. "But he understood it better than most." She paused beside me. "That takes something rare?" "Courage," I asked. "Conviction," she replied. "The kind you don't teach, the kind you catch." When she left, I stayed a little longer. Because in that moment, I realized something. Courage doesn't always wear stripes. Sometimes it just keeps breathing when silence tries to take its place. 2 days later, a message arrived from the Pentagon. Strategic Command Seat, full reinstatement, clearance restored, rank and privileges honored. It was everything I'd been denied, everything they'd erased. And I turned it down, not because I wasn't capable, but because I knew what it meant: boardroom diplomacy wrapped in clean suits and quieter kinds of silence. I'd spent too long watching truth buried beneath budget lines and press releases. I wasn't going back to be polished into someone else's legacy. Instead, I went back to the academy, not as a returning general, not as a survivor, just as Evelyn, a woman who still had something to give, and a generation who might be ready to hear it. Marina didn't return to the National Guard either. They offered reinstatement. She declined. When I asked her why, she met my eyes without flinching. "Because if anyone knows what it feels like to be betrayed from the inside," she said, "it's me. And I want to make sure no one else carries that weight alone." She joined a civilian oversight unit. Small, underfunded, underpublicized. The kind of organization people forget until it catches fire, but I knew she'd make it burn where it needed to. For the first time, we didn't feel like opposites on a ledger. We felt like balance. A week later, she picked me up in a quiet rental car, no uniform, no talk of politics. Just the hum of the tires and the weight of memories sitting between us like a passenger. We drove to the old base where I'd once commanded. Most of the buildings had been repainted. My name had long since been scrubbed from the plaques, but the air still remembered. Behind the parade yard, beneath the wide shadow of a chestnut tree that had survived more storms than either of us, we placed a small plaque in the soil. No names, no ranks, just a line carved into brushed steel, for those who died unnamed, but never unnoticed. We stood in silence for a long time. Grief doesn't always need language. Sometimes it lives in the stillness between breaths. The morning of my final lecture that term, I arrived early. The classroom smelled of dry markers and sunlight on tile. Cadets trickled in slowly, the sound of their boots echoing against the floor in practiced rhythm. Some glanced up at me, some didn't. They didn't know everything, and I didn't need them to. I erased the previous day's notes from the whiteboard. Then I wrote 2 words. Moral intelligence. I turned as the last student entered. Ethan. He walked slower than before. His shoulder was stiff, but he didn't lean. He nodded once and took his seat in the front row. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. When the room settled, I stepped forward. This isn't a class about war, I began. No slides, no tactics, no acronyms. It's about what happens after, when the weapons are lowered and all that's left is who you were during the silence. I paused. Let me tell you a story. And I did. I told them about a woman once labeled a nobody, about how she was erased from the rooms she built, about how she walked into battles without medals and left without applause, about how she chose not to return fire with vengeance, but with truth. I didn't name her. I didn't have to. By the end of it, they knew. You won't always be believed, I said, but live in a way that when the truth rises, it calls your name first. The room was still, not reverent, just awake. That's all I ever wanted. I still walk past the bulletin board near the cadet mess every morning. Someone pinned up a photo of me and Ethan arms, linked with a few other officers. The smiles aren't perfect, but they're real. Underneath it, in thick marker, someone wrote, "She didn't fight for attention. She fought for attention to the truth." That's the only legacy I'll ever need. Some days when the corridors are quiet and the lectures are done, I sit in the staff kitchen with a cup of bitter coffee and watch the light slide across the wall. The world still spins. Headlines still change. But I've learned something simple. Truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to be buried. And when you rise, not for applause, not for a title, but for integrity, you become unshakable. That's the kind of courage I teach now. Not in books, but in the silence that follows. The kind where someone finally listens. If you've ever been silenced, overlooked, or made to feel like your truth didn't matter, this story was for you. Evelyn's journey reminds us that we don't need permission to stand in our truth. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest convictions. Have you ever been told you were too much or not enough? Have you ever carried a truth that others tried to bury? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or simply feel seen, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on the notification bell. We have more stories like this, each one reminding us that dignity is not a privilege, it's a choice. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay grounded in your truth.